Welcome to the AfterWord, everybody.
Wow.
Oh, Eric is already regretting letting me host this week.
That didn't take long.
I think you were regretting it probably before we even started. But
Wait, he's doing what?
Oh, that was good.
He's
Good
regretting.
intro.
That was good.
Okay.
Well, yes. Welcome to the AfterWord, everyone. I am Betty Horiuchi. I'm joined with Kirsten Black, Vince Black, and Eric Reeves. And the purpose of our time together is to dive into the passage that was preached on Sunday a little bit more and see more of God's glory in it. I think that's everything. Great.
Good work.
Good podcast. Let's be done. Just kidding.
No.
No, that was a good introduction.
That wasn't
Yeah,
it.
I did what I needed to do.
Betty,
Just
thanks for
kidding.
stepping in. to
Are
host.
you regretting that you are hosting today?
Yeah, I think there's some regret, some sorrow. Okay. Anyway, today's intro question is, what is your best joke? Best appropriate joke.
Eric? Appropriate.
Yeah.
I don't want any potty language that we have to bleep out.
I don't know how to do that yet, so please don't do anything I need to bleep.
My go-to joke is, it makes me laugh every time. It's really not even good. Why is
You said earlier it was a good joke.
Oh, it's my favorite joke, but I know it's not a good joke. Why is a dinosaur big, green, and scaly?
I don't know.
Because if it was small, white, and smooth, it'd be a Tic Tac.
Oh, wow. Betty has her hand over her mouth right now. Maybe crying. I'm not sure.
It's a good one, isn't it?
Oh, man.
Can't top that, can you guys? We should probably just go to the recap. I mean,
I can top it.
Vince is currently on his phone looking for a joke. May it be noted.
There are some good
How
ones.
about you, Eric?
I don't have one. Actually,
I bet you do. It's
I
just
thought
not
you
as good
did.
as mine.
Yeah,
It's
that's
definitely
right. He's
not very good.
intimidated now.
I'm not a big joke teller. I don't know if that comes as a surprise or not. Cassie said one last week, and I'm not gonna
Cassie's
get it
also
right.
said you're not funny. Hasn't she?
She used to think I was funny when we were dating, I think.
Yeah. And then once she got you, she's like, yeah, I don't need to
She
tell
doesn't
him that
laugh at
anymore.
my stuff anymore.
Yeah.
I'm actually pretty funny, but she doesn't laugh anymore.
Yeah.
It goes something like this. What's the difference between a hot potato and a football, I think? What's the difference?
I don't feel like you're going into this with a lot of confidence.
Not.
I don't know what.
One is a hot yam, and the other one is a something ham. That's the joke.
That was a terrible
Wait,
execution.
Yeah, I don't get the joke.
The guy missed some words in there somewhere. But it's funnier if you have the right words.
All right, we're not gonna.
I didn't know
the
the question was, tell us some words that you know.
Okay, yeah, maybe you can work on that and come back next week because I don't get it at all.
Yeah, no, Cassie can correct me on that one.
Okay.
I missed some keywords.
Yeah, that's kind of important in a joke with
In
a
a joke,
punchline.
yeah.
How about you, Vince?
See, most of my jokes are longer and they're stories and they're on the edge of,
Inappropriate?
yeah, but not like foul inappropriate, just like it's maybe a little off color. Probably should not say that these days. That kind of thing. So I'll go with this one. Why do firemen wear red suspenders?
To keep their pants up?
Keep their pants up.
Keep their pants up.
That's it.
So it's funny because you think it's going to be something different.
Yeah. Kind of like yours. We thought it was going to have a punchline. And it didn't.
Man, I feel like we're 1 for 3. I'm giving myself a point, and I'm not giving either of you a
All
point.
right, buddy, so you have to say
Well, I have 2 jokes. One of them I just learned yesterday. Sorry. The first one, I always mess it up, but I won't mess it up as bad as Eric did. A grasshopper walks into a bar and orders a drink. The bartender says, "Hey, we have a drink named after you." And the grasshopper says, "You have a drink called Jamal?"
That's a good one.
She couldn't finish it.
A drink called Jamal.
That actually is pretty funny.
And then my
That is
other
funny.
one is what's green and fuzzy and can kill you if it falls from a tree.
I don't know what.
I don't know. Oh boy.
A pool table.
Hey, that goes along with my joke, I think. Yeah,
That's
a good
true, though, I suppose.
Yeah, that's the truth. That's not a joke.
That falls
Yeah.
from a tree. That will
Yeah.
kill you.
Yeah, that's not a joke.
Yeah, neither of these are that funny. I don't know why I'm laughing so hard.
I think we're learning that Betty really enjoys jokes. If
Her,
you know
her
Betty,
own, especially her
Yeah.
own
Yeah.
jokes.
I liked Kirsten's.
Thank you. I knew you would appreciate it.
I like puns. I like words that when you aren't really sure where they're going, and then it turns around. Like R.I.P. boiling water. You will be missed.
Wow. Wow.
It took me a minute.
Yeah.
I feel like we're in desperate need of a recap.
Yes. Eric, why don't you give us a recap of yesterday's sermon?
I would love to do that. So chapter 15 opens sometime, we don't know when, after chapter 14. And Samuel goes to Saul and says, I got a direct command from God for you. And the command is to wipe out the Amalekites. That God had remembered how the Amalekites had treated his people generations earlier. And he calls Saul to go wipe them out. So Saul summons an army. He goes, he fights against the Amalekites. The Kenites are also with him, so he lets the Kenites know first because they were friendly to Israel, so they leave. So Saul has war against the Amalekites. He has a victory over the Amalekites, but he and the people keep the king Agag alive. They also keep the best of the livestock alive, which God explicitly said none of those were supposed to be kept alive. And so God tells Samuel that he regrets having made Saul king because of his disobedience. And Samuel goes to confront Saul. He gets to Saul, and Saul says, I have done what the Lord told me to do. And Samuel says, well, what's all this livestock about? And so they go back and forth for a while. Samuel saying, why did you not obey? And Saul making excuses for his sin and saying, well, I did obey, or I didn't obey, but it's for a greater good, or I obeyed, but the people are the ones who disobeyed, over and over again. And finally, Samuel says that famous passage about God delighting in obedience over burnt sacrifices. And then Saul says, well, I've sinned. Would you come back with me to town? Samuel says no. Then Saul rips his robe. This is going to be important later in 1 Samuel. Saul rips his robe. Samuel says, great, that's a picture of what God is going to do. He ripped the kingdom away from you. You rejected God, and so God is now rejecting you as king over his people. Saul pleads one more time for Samuel to return with him for his saving his own face, really, for keeping up appearances. Samuel does go back to town with him, but he goes back to complete the obedience that Saul did not complete. So Samuel then executes Agag, that king of the Amalekites. And then the story ends in a really dark, sad note. They go their separate ways. They don't see each other again. And then it ends saying that Samuel grieved over Saul, and the Lord regretted that he had made Saul king over Israel. It's a depressing chapter.
Yes, sorry. I'm not used to this responsibility. I usually just do it as a joke. Eric, is there anything interesting from your study that didn't make it into the
That's
sermon?
a great question, Betty. Yeah. Actually, there's a ton in this chapter. There's in every chapter, so a lot doesn't make it in the sermon. Here's a few things I thought was interesting, at least. Samuel says to Saul that he pounced on the spoil. He uses that word, pounce. Well, we saw that word last week in chapter 14, but in a different context. Chapter 14, verses 32 says that the people pounced on the spoil and took sheep and oxen and calves, and that's where they just ate the meat raw. And then Saul, seeing what the people did back in chapter 14, Saul says that they have dealt treacherously. So Saul condemns the people pouncing on the spoil, but here in this chapter, Saul is the one pouncing on the spoil. And so it's just another picture of how far his heart had gone. Throughout this whole chapter, that word play that I pointed out a little bit yesterday of this Hebrew word to mean hear, listen, or obey, and the Hebrew word to mean sound is all the way through this chapter. The first one being that Saul is supposed to obey God. Then we see that it's the sheep and the oxen, the sound of those that now Samuel hears. And later on in this chapter where it talks about Saul not obeying the sound of the voice of the Lord, same words. When Saul says that he listened to the sound of the voice of the people, it's the same words. And so the author is being super clear and pointing out just how disobedient Saul was, the opposite of what he was called to do. The Kenites, there's a question about the Kenites. Who were these people? The story of them being kind to Israel actually is not recorded anywhere in the Bible. All we know of the Kenites are a couple small things. Moses' father-in-law was a Kenite, and so they probably are descended from Moses' father-in-law, likely friendly to the Israelites all through the generations, but we don't have an actual story of how they were friendly to the Israelites. Interesting where it says that Samuel was angry. If you remember that God says he regretted making Saul king, and then Samuel responds by being angry and crying out to God all night. We don't really know what he was angry about. It could have been he was angry about Saul's sin. Maybe he was angry about God's judgment upon Saul. Maybe he was angry of just how bad of a king Saul was. We don't know exactly why he was angry and what he was crying out to God. There's some speculation there. But certainly he was affected emotionally by all that was going on. And one more. Is it okay if I say one more? That was really interesting. There's twice in chapter 15 that refers back to a prophecy that Balaam back in Numbers 23 and 24 made. Balaam is this pagan prophet asked by a pagan king called Balak originally to do a curse upon Israel. God would not allow him. It's a strange story. God would not allow him to do a curse, but only blessed Israel. Well, part of what Balaam prophesies back then is what Samuel says with, let me see, verse 29 of chapter 15. Verse 29, it says that Samuel says that the glory of Israel will not lie or have regret, for he is not a man that he should have regret. It's not word for word, but it's really close to what Balaam the false prophet says back in Numbers chapter 23, verse 19. And then Balaam also talks about the fate of the Amalekites back in Numbers chapter 24, verse 20, which we see here happening, that they would be annihilated. So really, really curious how God uses this pagan prophet, and some of that comes back here in chapter 15.
Great. Thanks, Eric.
You're welcome.
I do have one more question before we get into some of the bigger questions. This was more like speculation with something that happened in the passage, but why do we think Saul spared Agag?
There's speculation, and you guys can speculate as well. One of the speculations is that he may have brought him back as a trophy from the war to parade around and say, look, we conquered these guys. Here's the king. I have him conquered. Now I'm dragging him around. So that's one thought. My own speculation is that. Another possibility could be he might want to use him as a tool for a bribe of sorts, or to get some sort of financial compensation. We see the Amalekites show up later, so they're still around, and so maybe having Agag would give him some leverage for some other personal gain. I'm not sure exactly what. Good question.
Great. Well, the first big question we'll jump into is one submitted by our listener. The question is, how do we use the knowledge of our infinite sinfulness before an infinitely holy God to move us to a place of joy versus being stuck in a place of morbid guilt, especially when we feel like we're constantly falling back into sin and putting Jesus back on the cross time and time again?
I think for me, the first thing is understanding that I understand that it's just the way the question was worded, but we're not putting Jesus back on the cross. Like, he died once and for all to cover all of our sin. And so understanding that we're not, while we definitely grieve God with our sin, we're not putting Jesus back on the cross over and over again. And so I think understanding maybe our brokenness and our sinfulness and the greatness of God's grace, and focusing on the fact that God's grace is so immense and it's so much greater than we understand, that if we understand the depth of our sin, then we can find joy in understanding that that has been erased. It's been forgiven over and over and over again. And so finding joy in the grace of God and his graciousness, that he's chosen us and has forgiven us. So I think it's maybe changing a focus from our own sinfulness and our own wickedness to the goodness and kindness of God.
First of all, I'm thankful for people sending in questions. It's helpful because we want to know how these things are hitting the people who are listening and be able to continue that conversation. So thanks for that. I want to make sure I hear the question right. Can you repeat the question?
How do we use the knowledge of our infinite sinfulness before an infinitely holy God to move us to a place of joy versus being stuck in a place of morbid guilt?
Yeah, you said some of this, Kirsten. I think some things have to be held in tension. The question itself has tension in it. That we hold together our ongoing sin with what it points us to, and that's our need, and our need is ultimately met in Jesus, and so that's relieved, and it doesn't. At least when the Spirit's at work in us, it doesn't produce guilt. It produces gratitude. That's the constant tension all the time, and I think that's the beauty of celebrating the Lord's Supper weekly. That we feel that tension, we experience that tension, that we are sinful, and while celebrating the Lord's Supper does not absolve us of sin, that we're not doing that so that we're absolved of sin. We're doing it as a reminder that we are sinful and we need someone to take care of that. So there's that tension even wrapped up in that celebration. We're going to experience some of that tension on Friday, Good Friday, where we experience, again, as we read through the events of Jesus' last hours, we experience again the death of Jesus. That reading is not meant to make us feel guilty. That reading is meant to turn us toward gratitude.
I think also a pretty common tool of the enemy is understanding that he wants us to feel defeated by and discouraged by our sin. And he wants to remind us over and over and over again about how bad we are and how our sin dominates our lives. And I think the enemy wants us to live under that condemnation. And so so just recognizing that is a way that the enemy tries to defeat and discourage us. And so rather than it's being well acquainted with your sin, but not dwelling on it and allowing that well acquaintance to turn you to God's glory and his forgiveness and his kindness and his graciousness. And so it's recognizing where we were and who we were before Christ and allowing that to fix our gaze on his goodness.
Yeah, I think this chapter allows one ditch to remain, and this is one of the ditches. We talk about the spectrum of those who tend to minimize sin and those who tend to dwell on sin. We talked a lot about in this chapter how it corrects us the view of minimizing sin, but I didn't do a great job of addressing, well, what about the other extreme if we dwell on our sin a lot? And that is another ditch that we fall into to find our identity primarily as a sinner rather than a saint now if you're a Christian. And it's a ditch. And so I think even being able to just say, yep, that is a ditch. That is definitely a temptation of certain personalities and certain people where they need to think more about the message of what Christ has done for you. Whereas people who fall in the ditch of minimizing sin, they just have like an opposite way to try to work to get back to a healthy view. What Christ did for you, absolutely. But what Christ did for you was covering a sin and a weight that is beyond your possible comprehension. So both of those things are true, but they both have ditches either way for sure.
Well, and I think the root of both of them is actually pride. It's thinking of yourself too much, either one way too highly or thinking of yourself too much in a low way. But in both perspectives, the view is self rather than God. And so maybe it's starting with a repenting of pride.
I feel like it kind of indirectly relates to what I was saying about rejection and just wrestling with I don't know, maybe the severity of like rejection when it's talked about, or when we talked about it in the passage. Now I'm trying to articulate my thought, but I think it still goes to like, when I think about it, I think it's easy for me to be motivated to a place of fear of rejection as like how I'm going to live or avoid sin, rather than having a complete and right view of what Christ did on the cross as he took on that rejection for us, and then just having a more complete understanding of who God is. Yeah, just like with, I actually don't know where I'm going with this anymore, but I feel like it kind of like related as we were talking about it. That's kind of like some of the stuff that I was wrestling with like the idea of rejection too.
That it feels really, really heavy, if I remember that conversation right.
Yeah.
And so the wrestling piece of that is what? It's what would you say? Like it's suffocating, it's just too heavy, it's hard to wrap your head around, or something different?
Maybe it's just that it's heavy. Like I think maybe it feels heavy because there's fear of rejection in other facets of life, so then bringing it into here, it is hard not to like let that be motivated by fear, maybe, if that makes sense.
What be motivated by fear?
Like rejection, and like how we like handle like Lord's rejection of us like under sin.
Are you saying like as a Christian to still have a fear of rejection?
Yeah, maybe. That's what I'm saying.
Well, and I think to loop the listener in, this was something we were talking about before the podcast started. And so just looping in at the end where it says that God rejected Saul, and the fear of a believer being rejected by God. Is that where the conversation started before we started the podcast?
Yeah, I would say so. And maybe it's just like the use of the word like rejection. It just is like a heavy and hard subject too. But maybe I'm not sure exactly what I was wrestling with. I just know that it just did something for me.
Well, I think in conversations like this, we have to go when they're confusing and when there's fear and when there's doubts that settle in. I think we have to go to what we know absolutely is true. And Eric, you ended Sunday on that from Romans, that there is nothing that will ever separate us. So we know that's true. We absolutely know that is true. So then if we know that's true, then what does our feeling of rejection actually mean? Is it just that we're feeling that? There's a fear there that we're sensing that. So we know that it's true that God will never leave us. He'll never forsake us. He won't reject us. There's nothing that separates us from the love of God because of Christ. If we know that's true, then the rejection we may be feeling either may be some temptation that the enemy's putting on us, something that we're believing in doubt, and so we work backwards to what we know is true.
Yeah, that tension between what our heart is believing and what our heads know, it seems like that pervades a lot of our reading of this chapter, because rejection is one of them. That was a big word from yesterday. And regret was another really big word, where we might know in our head certain things about, yep, this is who God is, but that's what the word means, but our hearts can feel something very different by those words.
Well, I think just to encourage each of us and anyone who's listening, if you have been called by grace through faith, one of God's children, adopted into his family, there is nothing that will cause God to reject us. There's nothing that will separate us. And Eric, you mentioned this in a very, very clear way yesterday, that those who are not followers of God are currently experiencing that rejection, and will if they do not believe. The only thing that keeps us from being near God is unbelief.
Yeah, and to that point, none of us who are alive are experiencing the full wrath of God on our sin yet.
Right.
God's being patient. But an unbeliever at some point, if remaining in unbelief, will experience God's full rejection and full wrath for eternity.
Yeah.
And maybe now that I'm thinking about it more, maybe where I was wrestling with it too is just in conjunction with maybe other lies and like things that I've been wrestling through on my own, and maybe just bringing in that word just felt heavier and
Oh,
harder.
so it triggered other things that you're already wrestling with.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's helpful because you're not going to be the only one who's feeling that too.
Maybe our other listener.
Yeah.
Yes.
That's right.
Well, I think the baggage that comes with the word rejection is that it feels very final. It feels complete and like it's finished. And so I think as a believer, we know that's not going to happen to us. And yet there's also a fear that comes with it because rejection brings a finality with it. And so, and we see that with Saul as the story goes on.
I think that's a really good point, really quick, Kirsten, because in chapter 15, God is specifically rejecting him from being king.
Not rejecting him.
That's right.
Yeah.
And so, at least according to the story goes, we still need to see in the coming chapters how that personal relationship or lack of relationship might play out.
Right.
In 15 is specifically the kingship.
So likewise, there are times where we would say God has rejected us from being ... For instance, the call on someone being an elder in a church is very high. That call, that qualification, that the gifting that God gives, that's a very high calling. If that person who is called to be an elder sins in a way that disqualifies him from that role, we would say that God, to put it in these words, God is rejecting that person from being an elder, not rejecting them from being a believer or being in his family, but rejecting him from being an elder in that time. Yeah, it's interesting. I wonder. I'm sorry, Kirsten. I see you lifting the mic there.
I see that mic.
Yeah, I see that hand. We don't. I mean, I always. It's maybe a fruitless exercise, but I often wonder at times when I read through narrative in the Bible, how could this story have gone differently? Like, I wonder if Saul would have done this. Would God have responded differently? So what would it have been to not have God reject him as king? And again, maybe a fruitless exercise, and we don't know. Would he repent? Would he turn? Would he, if he was not defensive but apologetic and remorseful, would that have changed God's response to what had been planned there? Anyway.
I was just thinking, I mentioned this earlier before we started the podcast, but I think just contemplating the concept of rejection can just serve as a warning to us in that do we have hearts that are soft and tender towards the Lord? And do we have a hatred for sin? And are we pursuing the things of God? And if we're not, then the idea of rejection can stand as a warning to us, because I think what we see in Scripture is that God is gracious and he's gracious and he's gracious. But if we keep rejecting him, if we keep hardening our hearts, then God ultimately says, okay, if you're going to harden your heart, then I'm going to help you harden your heart. We see that with Pharaoh, that it wasn't until the 5th or 6th plague in Exodus, it says up until the 5th or 6th plague, and Pharaoh hardened his heart, and Pharaoh hardened his heart. And then it switches to, and God hardened Pharaoh's heart. And so I think it is the same with rejection, in that if we're insistent upon rejecting the things of the Lord, if we refuse to soften our hearts, if we just continue on in sin, I think it reaches a point that God says, okay, I've warned you, I've given you grace, now I'm going to help you harden your heart. I'm going to help you reject me. And so I think that as believers, just the concept of rejection, it shouldn't strike fear in us, but I think it can come with a healthy warning for us.
Well, Eric, you started to get into this a little bit earlier, but speaking of other difficult words that begin with an R, regret is a word used in this passage multiple times, and I think the translation of it feels a little bit difficult to wrap our heads around. So let's just unpack this.
Yep, that Hebrew word translated in our English version, at least in the ESV, as regret is used 3 times in this chapter, and not always in the same way in this chapter either. Twice it's God regretting that he made Saul king, and once it's used in a context where Samuel is pointing out that God does not change his mind. It seems like God not changing his mind and not regretting. That's a little bit easier for us to get our heads around, as English speakers at least. The other two are harder. We saw yesterday that likely what's happening in Genesis 6 helps us with this, is that God is expressing his grief over Saul's sin, his grief over the effects of making Saul king, and his sorrow in that. But the word regret takes some work, at least from an English perspective, to get there. And that can be challenging.
I'd be really curious. We have several people in our church. I don't know if they are our listener, but we have several people in our church that English is their second language. And I'd be curious if you have a Bible in your original language, what the translation is there and how they've translated it in your language, and if it hits different. I don't know if this is just an issue of the English translation or if it's across the board. I don't know. If you're a listener and English is your second language,
we'll be waiting for your call. We've got the phones are ready. the lights.
Yeah, what's your number? Give me your number.
Yeah, give my number. All right, I may say something that will get me in trouble.
You have to retract it later.
It couldn't be worse than your joke, so it's okay.
I think it's a poor word choice in the English translation. I think in our current day, because regret, I think anybody, if you asked what to define regret, we would probably say it has something to do with a bad decision or a bad choice that
you would do differently.
That you would do differently if given the opportunity, or if you had the say so to do it differently, you would. I think that's how we would all define it, something like that. And so I think to use that word, I think it instantly is a word that puts us in a wrong direction. There are other places where the same Hebrew word is used where they do, I think, a better job of translating it. There's another place where it says that God was sorry that he had done something. I think while even that carries some baggage with it, as if God had done something that he needed to apologize for. He owed to the humans some response. I think that carries baggage with it. I think that does a better job than regret, because being sorry or having sorrow for a decision doesn't necessarily mean that decision was wrong. It just means that the consequences of that decision and the playing out of that decision is going to cause some heartache or grief for the person who's experiencing it. And that's something that God can do. We know that God cannot change. He cannot change his mind. But he's an emotive God, so he can feel sorrow over the consequences of
a right decision.
I'm trying to think of an example on the fly. It may not go well, but
so here's an example.
Okay, this is going to be good.
I'm making this up. Here we go. You ready? Let's say I pull my kids out for a week because they're going on vacation. Pull
them out of school
because our family needs it. Yeah, pull them out of school for a week. I know that's going to be a week's worth of homework when they get back. So I could say something like, "Man, I'm sorry, you guys are going to have so much homework when we get back, but we really need to do this."
Yep. But you probably would not say, "I regret," because that means, "Oh, I should have done that differently."
Yes, in the English sense, yeah.
Right. That's what I mean.
Yeah.
That's what I mean. So, it seems like a word. It's interesting to me. I won't say it negatively. It's interesting that that's the word choice that English translators have used, while in other places using the same Hebrew word, they translate it differently. So that brings some confusion, and I understand that's confusing. Like it's not something that we read. It's hard to read into who God. Read something about who God is and use a word like regret, because it automatically puts us in this place of thinking, I wonder what God did that was wrong. But we know cannot be.
Well, and that's even contrasted to, 28, 27, 30. I'm not seeing it. It's right in that area where it says that God does not regret. And so, here it is, 29. I said everything around 29. And also the glory of Israel will not lie or have regret, for he is not a man that he should have regret. And so even in that, I think it's confusing in the chapter that it says that God regretted, and then it says God does not regret. And so, and I know it's the same Hebrew word there, but even just the translation, I think if we could look at it in verse 11, maybe saying, and God had sorrow for making Saul king, and then understanding with the English translation of that God does not have regret, for he is not a man. And so just translating the same Hebrew word, but in different context differently. So understanding that one of them was something that led to God's sorrow, and the other is that God doesn't change his mind.
Yep. Eric, I think you did a great job on Sunday helping us feel that tension of what we see in this passage. And I think attaching it to Genesis 6, I think it's verse 6, where it says God regretted that he made mankind, but it moves on from that and gives a descriptor of what is meant there, that his heart was grieved. Mm-hmm. And I think that's how we have to read this passage too in 1 Samuel, that and that changes everything. I think if it says God regretted that he made Saul king, it grieved his heart that this was the outworking of it. So I think we have to keep that in mind as we look at this.
We will not go down this rabbit hole, but I'll just say this one thing. Even the fact that a completely sovereign, perfect God can be grieved by our sin, I can't completely wrap my mind around that either. That he can feel negative emotions based on actions that we have isn't easy for me to understand.
Yeah,
it's true. I mean, we see it here in Scripture. This is a great example of it, but I don't fully understand that.
Yeah.
That's funny because I get it.
Second to last question.
Oh.
Well, I'm not sure.
No, that's fine.
No, I'm not just sure how to ask the question. But I think one other...
Hey, you're doing a great job, by the way.
Thank you.
Yeah, we're accepting applications for new hosts. We'd like to have yours.
Great.
Yeah.
I'll send it in today.
In fact, don't worry about the application.
I'll just send you this podcast.
You've got the job.
A sample of your work.
I mean, Eric is going on sabbatical soon, so we're going to need a host for the.
Well,
we've regretted that we ever made Eric host.
Should have graduated earlier, so I could have stepped in.
Yep.
Oh, great! Now I forgot what I was going to ask. I think one other really hard point to wrap our minds around too is in the destruction of the Amalekites. We understand the women and men are destroyed, but also the livestock and then the children and the infants. And I don't know how to ask that as a question, but let's talk about that.
I like as hostess, you're not asking questions. You're just bringing up really hard things and then saying, discuss.
It's good facilitation.
Yeah, it is. You are bringing up. Yeah. And then it's quiet. No one wants to answer.
I think one of the things that came to mind is that in Exodus 17, verse 8, the Amalekites attacked the Israelites, and it was really out of nowhere. It was the Israelites were in the desert. They had just come out of Egypt, and the Amalekites come out of nowhere and attack them. And the Amalekites were a lot bigger. They were a lot stronger. They were a lot wealthier. They really gained nothing from attacking the Israelites other than to just be jerks. And so God says, I remember that. And so it doesn't necessarily bring comfort to the fact that there's women and children that are to be slaughtered. I can't wrap my brain around that necessarily. But I think the way that I bring a certain measure of comfort for myself in understanding it is trying to look at it from the perspective that God remembers. God remembers when we're wronged. God remembers when people sin against us. God remembers those things. And I mean, he says, vengeance is mine. And so this is a situation in which God remembers. And the Amalekites had attacked hundreds of years before. And so it was not something that was recent. And yet God remembers that, and he is defending and protecting his people. And he's saying, the Amalekites came against you, and I remember that. And so I'm going to bring justice about. And so understanding that God is a God of justice. He's not just love. He's not just kindness, but he's also justice and vengeance. And so understanding that this is reflective of who God is and the way that he radically defends and cares for his people.
Yeah, that's good. I think, again, we have to try as much as we're able to get at what the heart of God is. And in this case, that's what you're bringing up, that he is a God who remembers, and he keeps his promises, and he's one who will not forget those things he has said he would do. He upholds them. So that's a part of it. We spent many months in the book of Joshua, many months in the book of Judges. These same kinds of things, doesn't make it easier, but these same kinds of things come up where God demands total destruction of a people. And I think the thing that's helped me, it hasn't made it easy, but it's helped me, is to understand that any sin is an offense against God. All sin is, but any sin is whatever we would determine is small. Eric, you did a good job of bringing out those, like the things that we would brush off as small sins. That small sin, whatever we're thinking of, is an offense against God that demands God to be a just judge. And what he requires for sin is death. And this goes all the way back to how he cannot be in the presence of sin. And if he has made humans in his likeness to be in relationship with him, and sin is a part of their lives, he cannot be in the presence of that. Requires death as the punishment of sin. So all of that put together, any sin being an offense against God requires death. The Amalekites are a people who are not worshiping God. They are a people who are worshiping other idols and are against God and his people. Therefore, the right and just judgment against them is death as a people. It wasn't that these, I don't mean to minimize this at all, but I'll say it just to get to that point. It wasn't that the infant somehow sinned against God and his people by actively engaging in sin against them. But as an Amalekite, that infant, that animal, as being owned by an Amalekite, anything that was a part of the people was in a category of sin against God, and God promised to deal with it. He would be unjust not to. That doesn't make it easy. That doesn't put us in a place of saying, oh, okay, I get it then, carry on, God. It's still extremely difficult to comprehend. I think the question that we may need to be asking, and then I'll stop and let someone else talk. The question we may need to ask is, why would he not do that? Not why would he or how could he, but how could he not do that? Why would he not do that? And for us, I think it may be harder for us to understand because we have the storyline of Jesus. These people did not. For them, it probably made a lot of sense, for the people of this day. For us, we know Jesus, and we know the grace that's offered in Jesus. We know the mercy that's extended because of Christ. And so for us, we think we have this sort of, oh, God, why? Because we know that Jesus has stepped in to pay the penalty of that sin. And so it makes it really extremely challenging for us to understand as well.
I do think that it's very interesting that this text doesn't ask this question at all. God gives the command, and Saul goes and partially does it. It doesn't wrestle with these things, but we wrestle with these things deeply, partly because I think what you said, Vince, of the grace that we know through Jesus, is part of it, I think. It's the story feels really savage in some ways, doesn't it?
Yeah.
A people group going through and slaughtering everything alive, another people group, raiding their tents, like whatever that they're doing. It feels really, really savage. And it's shocking, and that's part of the point. Like, this is a picture of God at war against sin and what sin deserves. I mean, all of us included, right? And it is shocking and brutal and hard to stomach.
Yeah, and I think the same kinds of questions can be asked. I keep referencing this Friday evening as we think about the death of Jesus. The same kinds of questions could be asked in that. And in fact, Jesus does ask those questions. In the garden, is there any other way? On the cross, why have you forsaken me? I mean, there are some of those hard questions asked of God. This is Jesus, who is divine, asking hard questions of God about what is occurring. But it had to take place. It had to, so that the penalty of sin would be taken care of, so that we could enjoy relationship with God by grace through faith.
Well, I think it's interesting in verse 18, it says, "And the Lord sent you on a mission and said, go devote to destruction the sinners, the Amalekites." And so, I mean, they are being defined like the embodiment of sin is the Amalekite people. And so there's a very close link there between sinfulness and brokenness and death.
Yeah, like you said, Kirsten, earlier, the word rejection is a warning. This should serve as a warning as well on what the consequences of sin ultimately are. We have an example here of God's patience not being patient anymore with his wrath upon sin. So they're wiped out. Well, they're not completely wiped out. They show up later again. But the command...
Spoiler alert. Spoiler alert.
Yeah, that's right. So we see example of here of God not being patient anymore with the Amalekites, which points to his patience then with us and other people groups that he does not do this with. So it should serve as a warning that God will not be patient forever. This is the sort of wrath that he has towards sin, and beautifully so for Christians, right? We want God to be just. We don't want him to put up with sin, ultimately. So there's a warning here.
I think what passages like this actually reveal is that we want him to put up with sin when it feels gross, like the killing of children. And yet that takes me to the passage here where God told Saul, you need to completely destroy the Amalekites and all the livestock and all the women and children and the kings and everything. And Saul kind of picked and chose what he thought was good. Like, he picked out the best livestock and he kept it, and he picked out the king and he kept it, and he didn't obey. And yet I don't know that we're that much different than Saul. That when we come across these really hard passages that feel hard to understand, and it feels hard to reconcile the character of God with it, rather than saying, okay, Lord, because you said it, I'm going to trust you. I think this is where we start to question, we start to push and start to hedge and say, is that really what you meant? Is that really your intent there? Because that sure doesn't seem right. I mean, Saul saying, this is a perfectly good lamb. Why would I kill it? Because God said kill it, and so I think we're confronted with that too. And some of these things that are really hard to understand and comprehend, we start to question a little bit, what does this mean? Or how does God's character fit into this? And I think we have to say there's mystery involved. There's times that we don't understand why God asks certain things in obedience. And so we have to land on, because God said it, I'm going to obey, even if I don't understand.
Yeah, and I think one thing we can forget is that of most importance to God is his own worship. And when there is a people group that is adamantly opposed to his worship, it is within his right and responsibility and justice to do what needs to happen to show that people group is adamantly opposed to him. He is about his worship.
And that is good for his people.
Yep.
It can sound like an egotistical maniac, but his worship, his jealousy for his worship is good for his people. So then by extension, this command to wipe out the Amalekites, the sinners, at least in a sense, is also good for his people.
Yeah.
If it really is about the worship of himself.
Yeah.
Well, and you can see why he rejected Saul, because Saul won this battle, and then he went up and he set up a monument to himself, you know? And if you compare that even to like Exodus 17, where Moses fights the Amalekites, and it says that Moses set up a monument and he said, "The Lord is my banner." And you just compare the two of them, that Moses set up this monument to point to God and to his faithfulness and his goodness. Saul sets up a monument to himself. And I'm like, no wonder God is rejecting him as king. No wonder God is saying, you know, I'm done with you, because Saul is all about his worship and his own glory and not about God's.
Yeah. I think we have to see this throughout, and we need to get to our last question, but I think we see this throughout. A prime example of this, a story that nearly everyone, churched or unchurched, knows, is the David and Goliath story. And I think we often turn that into a story about the unlikely hero who kills a giant, or the courage that David must have had. But if we step backwards a bit and say, no, this was actually about the worship of God. These are the Philistines who are adamantly opposed to God. And so for David to step in is actually a fight against a people who are against God, which is ultimately about God's worship. So all of these stories circle back around to being about God's worship ultimately. Betty, do you have any final questions for us?
That's a good question, Vince. I do have one more question, an important one that Eric often forgets.
I still regret that we made him host.
The final question is, what in this passage raises your affections for God?
That was a great question, Betty.
Thank you. I just thought of it on the
That was
spot.
a good question. The way that you asked it was calm. It was kind. You remembered to ask it. It warms my heart like no other.
Thank you, Vince.
Can I go first?
Of course you would. Of course you would.
The fact that I sin daily, the fact that I reject God daily, he does not reject me because of Jesus. That is incredible. It's probably a truth that we say we know, but I think it hit my heart in a different way this week.
That's good. I'm not going to use the word regret, but the fact that God is a God who grieves deeply over sin and the sin of and the effects that sin has on his people whom he loves. That
cold,
we have a God who is grieving over what we experience because of the choices we are making.
I think for me, I went to Hebrews 4:15, for we do not have a great high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weakness, but one who in every respect has been tempted as we are, yet without sin. And just considering the fact that Jesus has felt everything that we have felt and has dealt with everything that we've dealt with, and he did it without sin. And so understanding that our sin grieves the heart of God, and that God does have emotion and he feels things, and Jesus that much more, that he was here and he experienced it, and yet he was able to endure it without sin. And so just the fact that God would send Jesus, even though God is already feeling grief over our sin, he sends Jesus as this perfect sacrifice who felt it that much more on our behalf.
What about you, Betty?
Thanks, Eric. I think for me, it's just what we were talking about with rejection and the reminder that this isn't meant to be something that instills fear in me, but yeah, just that Christ took that rejection on for us, and that we don't have to sit in the fear of that, and that that through the Spirit we're learning to also reject sin in that same way. Yeah. That's pretty cool. Oh, well, thanks for listening, everybody.
Some reminders. Good Friday, 6:30.
Yes.
This Friday. Were you going to say that?
No.
I didn't want to steal your thunder.
I wasn't going to.
Saturday, 11:30, at the building.
Yes.
for an Easter egg hunt for the youngins and a picnic for all of us. It's a good opportunity for us to be together as a church. So if you have, let's make a weekend of this. Saturday, 11:30. Sunday, 8:30 or 10:30. And donuts.
And baptism.
Betwixt.
Oh, you had to bring in baptisms. Donuts.
Donut.
No, baptisms also. If you haven't been baptized, we'd love to talk to you about it.
Yep. Yeah, please contact me.
So that means we will not be doing 1 Samuel next week. But in 2 weeks, we will be in 1 Samuel 16.
Oh, so is there no podcast next week?
Oh, that's a good question.
Oh, I
Remains
asked
to be
it
seen.
on the air.
Oh.
On the air. How about next week we all come with our favorite jokes and we just spend an hour.
It's going to be a short podcast.
It's okay. I have a lot.
All right.
Okay. Well, thank you, everybody. We'll see you whenever we do this again. Have a great week.
Have a great week.
Bye.
Bye.